The church smelled like lilies and old wood. I hadn't been back in Austin for a decade. And yet here I was, sitting in the back pew, watching people who barely knew my father pretend to mourn him. The air felt thick with perfume, whispers, and fake sympathy. I didn't belong here anymore. Not in this house. Not in this family. Not even in this town. Jacob stood at the front, tall and polished in his navy suit, shaking hands like a politician. My sister Emily hovered beside him, touching his arm, smiling too wide at everyone who came up to her. They both looked like they had been waiting for this day to arrive. And maybe they had. When the service ended, everyone moved to the family house. The big white one on Lakeview Drive, that still looked like it had been pulled out of a magazine from the 90s. There was food, wine, and forced laughter. I stayed near the window, hands in my pockets, watching the clouds outside roll over the lake. The lawyer, Mr. Lane, arrived just before sunset. He was the same man who had handled my father's business for years. A quiet type who always wore the same gray suit and carried a folder that looked older than I was. He set his briefcase on the table, cleared his throat, and said, "Your father wanted me to read the will here, with everyone present." The room fell silent. Jacob leaned back on the couch, confidence oozing out of him. Emily crossed her legs and pretended to be patient. My mother sat in the corner, quiet, her hands trembling slightly on the glass of water. Mr. Lane began to read. To my eldest son, Jacob Cole, I leave full control and ownership of coal freight and logistics, including all related assets. Jacob smiled like he had just been crowned king. People clapped politely. To my daughter, Emily Mason, I leave the vacation property in Naples, Florida, along with its contents. Emily put a hand over her heart and gave a small, fake laugh, pretending to cry. She was always good at pretending. Mr. Lane paused, looked down at the final page, then at me, and to my youngest son, Ethan Cole. He said, I leave my personal laptop. It's in the study, on his desk. That was it. A few people glanced at me, waiting for me to react. I didn't. Jacob smirked. Perfect, he said. Maybe you can finally fix Dad's computer for a living. Emily let out a short laugh. Yeah. Perfect for your little tech dreams. Ethan. Laughter rippled through the room. Even a few of Dad's old business friends chuckled quietly. My mother looked down at her lap, too ashamed or too afraid to stop them. I stood there, silent, my hands tightening around the armrest of the chair. When the laughter died down, I walked to the study. The laptop was still there, sitting on the old oak desk. Dust clung to it like a thin coat of snow. I brushed it off with my sleeve and looked at the faint engraving near the hinge W. C. My father's initials. The hinges creaked when I opened it. The screen stayed black. I didn't bother turning it on. I closed the lid again and carried it out under my arm. As I walked past the living room, Jacob's voice followed me. Hey, little brother, he said. Dad always said you were smart. Guess he changed his mind. I didn't answer. I stepped out onto the porch. The air outside was cool and smelled like rain. Behind me, I heard glasses clinking, laughter, music playing too loud for a funeral. I walked to my car parked by the gate, opened the trunk, and set the laptop inside. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at it. The sky above the lake was turning orange, the kind of color that made you feel like something had ended long before it should have. I closed the trunk and looked back at the house. Through the window, I could see them celebrating like vultures who had found a feast. Maybe they really believed they had won, I whispered to myself, barely loud enough to hear it over the wind. We'll see who was right. Dad. Then I got in the car and drove away, leaving the house, the laughter, and everything else behind. Chapter 2. I took the long way home through side streets I barely remembered. The lights on South Lamar were bright and flat, the way they always looked after a funeral, like the city had the decency to keep its face expressionless. I parked behind my building and carried the laptop up the stairs with both hands, as if it might split in two if I relaxed. Inside, The apartment felt smaller than ever. I left the lights off and set the laptop on the kitchen table. The hum of the fridge filled the silence. I washed my hands, dried them on a dish towel that had seen better days, then pulled out a chair and sat. The old machine waited in front of me, square and stubborn, like a final assignment I had ignored for years. I wiped the lid with my sleeve and popped it open. The hinge protested but held. Nothing came on. No fan. No line of pixels waking up along the bottom edge. I closed it again, put it on its side, and checked the battery latch out of habit. It was the same model my father used in the study when I was still around. Sturdy. Heavy. No nonsense. I dug through a drawer until I found a power brick that might fit. It did. I ran the cord to the outlet by the stove and watched a tiny light near the hinge flicker to life. While I waited, I stared at the window. My face looked older in the glass than I expected. 10 years will do that to anyone. 10 years will do worse if you spend them alone. I told myself that was fine. I had chosen work that did not care about dinners or birthdays. Code that did not punish me for missing another holiday. Still, something about the last hour stuck in my ribs and would not let go. Maybe it was Jacob calling me little brother like we were still kids. Maybe it was Emily using that voice she saved for charity galas and pity. The light turned solid. I pressed the power button. The fan whirred and a boot screen crawled up in slow motion. It hung for a while, then asked for a password. I leaned in and tried the obvious ones. His name. My name. The name of the company. The model of his favorite truck. Each wrong attempt stacked on the last like a little insult. I sat back and rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling the dull ache of a long day. The wedding date came to mind without effort, not because Jacob or Emily ever cared about it, but because my father did. He used to make a bad joke every year about how remembering it was cheaper than flowers. I tapped 8 numbers into the box. 070619880. I pressed enter. The screen paused like it was thinking, then unlocked. A plain desktop appeared, gray and uncluttered. There were almost no icons. My father never liked clutter. In the center sat a single folder named Legacy. The word sat there so simple it almost felt like a dare. I did not open it. Instead, I pushed back from the table and walked to the sink for a glass of water. The faucet sputtered before the stream smoothed out. I took a long drink, set the glass down, and braced my hands on the counter. My reflection in the window looked like someone who had been away too long and had no one to blame but himself. The night tugged at an old memory I usually kept locked up. The garage behind the house in the heat of a Texas summer. The door rolled up. A box fan shoving hot air around without helping. My father sat at the workbench with a beige tower case cracked open next to him. He had a pair of glasses on he never wore in public. He asked me to bring him a flash drive from the kitchen drawer. He said we were going to try something new with a smile that belonged to a younger man. I remember standing beside him while a black window opened on the screen, and lines of white text ran like a small parade. He told me this was a different way to keep value. He said banks were good until they were not, and paper was good until it was not, and that sometimes you had to learn a language before the rest of the town knew it existed. I nodded like any 20-something who loves his father but thinks the old man is being dramatic. He laughed and told me that patience is the only code everyone forgets to write. Back at the table, the laptop waited. The folder named Legacy kept its spot in the middle of the screen like a single eye. I moved the cursor toward it and stopped. It felt wrong to rush. If there was anything at all inside. It had sat in the dark for years. Another 10 minutes would not hurt it. But moving too fast might hurt me. I closed the window blinds and turned on the small lamp by the couch. I put the laptop on my knees and listened to the fan settle into a steady hum. I set a timer on my phone and told myself I would open Legacy when it went off. I was not sure why a timer made sense, but it kept me from acting on the kind of impulse that had led me out of that house in the first place and into a decade of noise. While the timer counted down, I pulled an old notebook from the shelf and flipped through the pages. Server passwords. Build notes from a startup that barely paid me. Half-finished ideas. Scraps of code written at 2 in the morning when I wanted to feel smarter than my life. Between 2 pages. A photo slipped out and fell to the rug. My father and I in the driveway with a fishing pole leaning against the bumper of his truck. He was pointing at something off camera. I was laughing. There was oil on his sleeve. He looked like a man who could fix anything with a wrench. And a quiet minute. I put the photo back in the notebook and set it on the table. The timer buzzed. I picked up the laptop again. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, then drifted away. I needed one more thing before I opened it. Not a drink, not courage in a bottle. I needed to know whether I was doing this to prove Jacob wrong, or to hear my father one last time. The house on Lakeview Drive had always been loud with other people's opinions. My apartment had only mine. Tonight it felt like neither place had room for what waited in that folder. I told myself a simple rule. I would not open Legacy unless I could look in the mirror and say I was ready for what came next if there was nothing there. Or worse. If there was something that would tear the last good thread between me and my father. I walked to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror above the sink. The overhead bulb flickered once. I saw the lines around my mouth. A touch of gray that had not been there the last time we stood in a room together as a family. I said it out loud anyway. Without drama. I am ready. Back at the table. I set the laptop down and rested my palms on the edge. I noticed a faint scratch near the touchpad. My father had a habit of tapping his ring when he thought through a problem. The pattern was always the same. 3 soft taps. A pause. 2 more. I did it without thinking. 3 and then 2. The sound was nothing. But it steadied me. I slid the cursor to the folder named Legacy and waited for the rush of impulse to pass. I thought about the people in that house and all the things they believed they had won. I thought about all the times I told myself moving away was the right thing, and all the nights that did not feel like victory. I thought about the garage on a hot afternoon and how my father did not need me to agree with him, only to listen. I rested a finger on the trackpad and pulled it back. Not yet. I wanted to be quiet for one more minute. I wanted to hear the fan in the fridge and the distant traffic on the highway. The ordinary music of a night when nothing happens. Because that is what good things sound like before they begin. I closed the lid just enough to dim the screen, then lifted it again. Legacy still waited. I pressed my thumb to the corner of the laptop and held it there until the heat bit my skin. I took a breath, long and slow, and let it out. I was not going to run from this. I was not going to perform for anyone either. I touched the folder once, felt the trackpad register, and then I stopped my hand again. I could hear my father in the back of my head. Not with a speech. Not with a lecture. Just a steady thought that sounded like him. He wanted me to move when I meant it. He wanted me to act like a man who understood that value hides in plain view and does not need applause. I pushed back the chair. I left the laptop open on the table. I walked to the bedroom and pulled a blanket from the closet. I came back and set it over the back of the chair for later. Then I sat again and put my hands in my lap. The cursor still hovered over Legacy. When I finally moved, it was not because of anger or pride. It was because the room had gone quiet enough for me to hear what was left of him. I rested my fingertip where it needed to be and prepared to click. Chapter 3. My phone buzzed against the table and broke the stillness I had fought for. I let it ring. It buzzed again. Then again. The way a mosquito circles a lamp until it finds a soft place to land. I turned the screen over with 2 fingers. Emily had sent a message that said she thought the laptop should stay in the family house. A second message followed that said it was a keepsake and would look nice in the study where Dad used to sit. She added a heart, as if that could dress the words in good intentions. I put the phone face down and rested my palm on the corner of the laptop to keep myself from reacting. Another vibration. A call this time. Mr. Lane. I took it because he was one of the few people in that world who ever spoke to me like a person. His voice sounded tired. He said the house had turned into a reception rather than a wake. He said Jacob was already taking a victory lap through the living room, and Emily had people laughing by the window like it was a garden party. He said he had done his duty and read the will, and that he was leaving before anyone asked him to drink to new beginnings. He paused, then said he needed to mention something for my awareness. He reminded me that the document covered the assets listed, and that anything not listed would not be divided unless there was a codicil or a schedule that referred to it. He said that if there were any digital assets, they would be treated differently, and that without explicit identification and access, they were functionally outside the estate. He added that there was no such schedule in the binder he had received from the hospital, and that he had looked twice. I thanked him and told him I appreciated the call. He told me to be careful. He said grief made people kind, or it made them curious. and that curiosity around money was simply greed saying it wanted a glass of water. He cleared his throat in that way he did when he did not want to be quoted for anything. Then he hung up. I sat there with the phone warm in my hand. The cursor still hovered over legacy. A steady little light waiting for me to move. I thought about the party across town. My brother playing host. My sister making jokes that sounded like high fives. The picture made my stomach pull tight. I let the feeling pass. Then I set the phone on the table and slid it just out of reach. Another message from Emily popped through anyway. A photo this time. The study with the light left on. The old desk. The leather chair where Dad used to fall asleep during late games. The caption said, "The room felt empty without the laptop." I tapped the screen off and told myself not to take the bait. She had always been good at dressing pressure up as sentiment. I needed air. I cracked the window and listened to the cars on the highway. The night smelled like wet concrete. I closed my eyes and tried to picture Dad at that desk, tapping his ring on the wood, the way he always did when he was thinking through a knot. 3 soft taps. A pause. 2 more. I did it with my fingertips on the table. It helped me hear my own thoughts again. The phone buzzed with a number I did not know. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a transcription showed up. Jacob used a calm voice that he borrowed for investors and judges. He said the family wanted to keep items together for sentimental reasons, and that I could drop the laptop off and pick it up later after they had cataloged everything. He added that it would be simpler for everyone if I did not make this uncomfortable. I deleted it without listening to the audio. I imagined him grinning into the phone while he said it. I stood, stretched my back, and walked to the sink, ran a little water into the glass I had left there, took a drink, set the glass down, walked back to the table. My hand lifted, then fell. I was ready in the way a person is ready before the plane leaves the ground. The body knows what to do. The mind keeps thinking about 100 tiny mechanical failures. I told myself that fear is just a feeling passing through, and that the only way out was through. The phone buzzed one more time. This time Emily said Jacob had called a family friend who did digital forensics, and that he could take a look at the laptop to make sure nothing was corrupted. She said she could swing by to pick it up and save me the drive. I took another breath and set the phone on the counter. I did not answer. Silence is underrated. Much later, after everything that followed, I would learn that Jacob did more than call a friend. He reached out to a private investigator named Harris, who had a reputation in Houston for finding money that wanted to hide. At that moment I did not know the name, only the feeling that something had shifted in a room I was not in. I dimmed the screen and then brightened it again. Legacy waited in the center like a button on a life raft. I moved the cursor away, opened System Preferences, and checked the wireless settings. I turned everything off. I pulled the Ethernet cable out of the back like a habit I had kept even though the line was dead. I touched the ports just to feel the quiet of them. I did not want any curious software talking to any curious place while I was still deciding what I wanted to know. I took a pad and pen and wrote the time. Wrote the battery level, wrote the temperature in the room from the small thermostat on the wall. It was the sort of detail that would look paranoid to someone who had never worked in security. To me, it was just the way you begin something you might need to explain to yourself later. The apartment thinned out to its sounds. The fridge compressor. The soft tick of cooling metal in the stovetop. A neighbor in the hall letting a door close too hard. I let the noises run until they turned to wallpaper. I could feel tension leave my neck as I went through basic checks. I opened the file manager and looked at the drive. Old folders with boring names. Receipts. Invoices. A scan of a warranty for a lawnmower. A subfolder with photos from a fishing trip to the coast. These ordinary things let me breathe. It was like walking into a warehouse and finding the same pallets you would find anywhere. No drama. No danger. The drama lives in the thing you are afraid to open. The phone buzzed once more. Softer. That setting that sounds like someone tapping a wristwatch. Emily again. She said she was thinking of Mom, and that it would mean a lot if the study looked the way it used to when Mom woke up in the morning. I could almost see her pressing send with a small smile. I put the phone in a drawer and closed it. For a second I wondered if I should drive the laptop back to the house and set it on the desk just to stop the noise. Then I pictured Jacob leaning in the doorway of the study. Arms folded. Doing that little half-laugh he uses when he thinks he has outplayed you. The thought cleared the fog out of my head. I sat again and placed my hands where they needed to be. The memory of the garage returned in a different way. Not the fans and the summer heat. This time it was the look my father gave me when he wanted me to stop performing intelligence and start using it. He did not want a show. He wanted a result. He wanted patience. I told myself the truth. I was not opening this because of Jacob or Emily or the people at the house who thought they had watched me lose. I was opening it because my father had spoken to me in a language only he and I shared. And because a man should answer when his father calls his name from the other side of the dark. There was a knock at my door. A quick one and then a second that sounded friendly but insistent. I froze, and then laughed at myself for freezing. It was probably a neighbor. I looked through the peephole. An older guy in a polo I did not recognize stood there with a small briefcase. He took a step back and glanced at my door number. Then at a note on his phone. I stayed quiet. He knocked again and said through the door that he was from a service that handled estate cataloging and that he had been told I might need a hand moving a computer. He did not shout. He did not try the handle. He waited 20 seconds and left. I kept watching the hallway for another minute, until I heard the stairwell door open and shut. I went back to the table and sat down slow. I let the adrenaline drain. I felt a little foolish and then a little grateful that my instincts were awake. I wrote another note on the pad. Someone came by regarding an estate service. I wrote the time again. Then I drew a small box next to the word legacy and filled it in with the pen until the square was black. I moved the cursor back over the folder and let it sit there. I could see the faint tremor in my finger from the knock at the door. I placed my other hand on top of it until the tremor settled. I thought of the ring tap pattern. 3. Pause. 2. I did it on the table. Then I rested my fingertip on the trackpad and committed myself to the one thing I could control. I would act on purpose. I clicked. Chapter 4. The folder opened with a soft delay. Like the machine was taking a breath. For a second the screen froze. Then a single file appeared in the middle. Wallet. Dat. No other folders. No notes. No explanations. Just that one file sitting there. Gray against the dark background. My heartbeat jumped once, and then settled into a steady drum. I knew that name. I had not seen it in over a decade. But I knew it. I stared at it for a while, letting the weight of it sink in. The old memory came back in pieces. My father asking me about encryption. The night we spent arguing about how digital currency was a gamble. The way he smiled like he was already holding the future in his hands. It had felt like a phase back then. A hobby for a man too stubborn to retire. I leaned back and rubbed my face. The air in the apartment had gone still. I grabbed my phone, scrolled down to a name I had not used in months, and hit call. Tommy answered on the second ring. His voice sounded half awake. Jesus. Ethan. You know what time it is. Yeah. I need your help. It's about my dad's laptop. There was a pause on the line. What kind of help? I found a file. It's called Wallet. Dad. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm on my way. Don't touch anything. And for God's sake, disconnect from the internet if you haven't already. I told him I had. He hung up without saying goodbye. That was Tommy. I closed the lid and went to the kitchen, filled a mug with coffee I didn't really want. The bitterness cut through the taste of nerves sitting in my throat. Half an hour later, there was a knock at the door. Tommy came in wearing a hoodie and carrying a small black bag that looked like a doctor's kit for paranoid people. He nodded toward the table. That it? I opened the laptop and pointed at the screen. Just one file. Wallet. Dot. He whistled low. Old school. He sat down, unrolled a cloth sleeve of cables and drives, and pulled out a portable solid state. We're not touching that drive directly. First rule. We make a clone. I watched him work. He moved like a surgeon. Precise and quiet. The screen filled with lines of code. He checked hashes. Verified sectors. Copied data to the clean drive. All right, he said. We've got a copy. What do you want to do? I want to know what's in it. Tommy nodded. Clicked through a few menus. Then froze. It's encrypted. Can you open it? He looked at me. Depends. You got a password? I hesitated. My hand started tapping the edge of the table. 3 light taps. Pause. 2 more. The pattern. My father's pattern. Tommy caught it and raised an eyebrow. You remembering something? I exhaled. Try 070619880. He typed it in. The cursor blinked. A small window appeared. Wallet unlocked. Tommy leaned back. Holy hell. I leaned forward. What? This is one of the earliest builds. The file headers date back to 2011. Maybe late 2010. This thing could hold anything. Back then, people mined thousands of coins a week on a laptop like this. He began mapping the addresses stored inside. Dozens of lines appeared. Each one, a long string of letters and numbers. These are all public keys. Each one could hold funds if they're unspent. We'll check them. He moved to another machine he had brought. One that could connect to the blockchain without exposing the original laptop. I sat still, listening to the soft hum of fans and his typing. Minutes passed. The glow of the monitor cast long shadows on the wall. Then Tommy stopped. He pushed the chair back slightly and stared at the screen. What? I asked. He turned toward me slowly. Ethan, you might want to sit down. I'm already sitting. He swallowed, cleared his throat, then said it. These addresses, they're full. Not just full. Untouched. 800,000 Bitcoin. None of them ever moved. I blinked at him. 800,000 what? Bitcoin. It's like finding a chest in your attic with the first gold ever minted and realizing no one ever claimed it. At today's value, it's north of $80 billion. The room went silent except for the fan. I stared at the screen. The numbers scrolling like some fever dream. I felt my chest tighten. That can't be right. Tommy nodded slowly. It's right. These coins were mined before the difficulty spike. Before companies took over, whoever had this file back then was in early. Real early. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. He told me he was experimenting. He said it might be the future. Tommy leaned forward. Ethan, your father didn't just see the future. He owned it. I couldn't speak. My hand hovered above the keyboard like it didn't belong to me. The numbers on the screen didn't feel real. Not like the kind of money anyone could hold. I thought of Jacob's smirk, Emily's laugh, the look in their eyes when I carried that dusty laptop out of the house. My throat burned. Tommy broke the silence. You need to back this up. Cold storage only. 2 copies minimum. No internet. No cloud. If someone finds out about this, you won't sleep again. I nodded, still staring at the balance. It's more than everything they own put together. Tommy looked up from his keyboard. It's more than all their houses, their cars, and their companies combined 100 times over. I reached for the mouse. A small text file had appeared in the directory. Timestamped the moment we unlocked the wallet. I opened it. One sentence sat there, written in my father's old typeface. Only you would know what this means. Dad. My chest felt hollow. Tommy watched me carefully. His usual smirk gone. You okay? I nodded but didn't mean it. He left it for me. Tommy rubbed the back of his neck. You need to keep it that way. Whatever this is. It's not just money. It's history. And history has teeth. He helped me copy the data to an external drive and unplugged every cable like we were performing a ritual. When it was done, we sat in the dim light. Both of us too wired to move. Tommy zipped up his bag and stood. I'm taking the clone with me for safekeeping. Don't turn that laptop on again unless I'm here. We'll talk tomorrow. Lock your door. When he left, I locked it twice. I walked back to the table. The laptop screen still glowed. The message from my father hovering like a whisper across time. Only you would know what this means. I read it again and again until the words stopped looking like words. Then I reached over, closed the lid, and sat there in the dark with the sound of the fan winding down. I thought about everything that had just shifted in my world. It wasn't pride I felt. It wasn't even relief. It was something deeper, colder. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the wind was carrying your name. Chapter 5. Morning came in thin lines through the blinds and found me still at the table. I had slept on the couch with my shoes off and one hand on the closed laptop, like a man guarding a campfire. Coffee tasted like metal. The apartment felt different, as if the night had rearranged the air. I powered the machine and checked what Tommy and I had done. The clone sat safe on the solid-state drive he had brought. The original file was still in place. I confirmed the wireless was off. I confirmed the ports were quiet. I checked the keyboard for the small pattern of dust I had noticed near the arrow keys, and saw it the same as I had left it. Then I shut the lid and told myself that from this point forward every move needed to make sense tomorrow. Not just right now. I texted Tommy and told him I was good, and asked him to hold the clone until we met again tonight. He replied with a thumbs up. Then a second text that said he would bring a sealed kit for a cold wallet, and we would set it up off-grid. He finished with a reminder that secrets die in noise and live in quiet. I set the phone face down and let that sink in. Around 10 there was a knock that felt familiar. I did not look through the peephole at first. I knew the rhythm. When I opened the door, Jacob stood there in a pale shirt with the sleeves rolled once, and a bottle of expensive bourbon in a gift bag. He smiled the way he smiles at investors and surveyors. He said he wanted to stop by to check on me and to pay his respects in private. He said apologies if this was a bad time. He lifted the bag as if to prove he meant well. I held the door with my foot. He asked if he could come in and sit for a minute. I said yes because saying no would make a larger scene than I wanted in the hallway. He stepped inside and scanned the room in a way that tried to look casual and failed. He put the bag on the counter and said he remembered the old nights when Dad used to drink a finger of this and talk about routes and trucks and timing. He said he missed that and that we should each have one for the old man. I told him I had work to do this morning, and that I did not plan to drink. He said he understood and poured himself one anyway. Small. As if that made it polite. He asked about the will as if we had not both heard it. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said family mattered. He said as the new head of the company, he wanted to keep things smooth. He used the word smooth 3 times. His eyes drifted to the table where the laptop sat with the lid closed. He asked if that was the one. He said the study looked strange without it, and that Mom would feel better if the room looked the way it always had. He said we were planning to have the estate cataloged, and that a friend who did digital inventory could make sure the machine had no sensitive data. He smiled and said, better safe than sorry. I told him Mom mattered to me more than rooms, and that I was taking care of what Dad left me. I said I would return what belonged in the house, and I would do it when I was ready. He nodded in a way that said he heard words but did not accept them. He asked to use the bathroom. I pointed down the hall and watched him go. I could hear the faucet turn, and the cabinet door under the sink close and open. He was gone longer than he needed to be. When he came back, he asked if I had considered joining the company in some advisory capacity now that things were settling. He said there might be a role for me if I was willing to be a team player. I told him I had projects and that I was staying in my lane. He smiled at that and said staying in lanes was exactly what he liked to hear. He finished his drink and set the glass on the counter. He said we would talk soon and that he was only a call away. Then he left with the same smile he had arrived with. As if the visit had accomplished something I would learn in a moment. When the door clicked shut, I stood still for a full minute and let the quiet come back. I walked to the bathroom and looked under the sink. Nothing obvious. I checked the cabinet above the toilet. Nothing. I went back to the kitchen and sat with the laptop and watched it for a moment the way you watch a sleeping dog before you reach to pet it. I powered it up and watched the logs. I checked the system clock against the note I had made last night. A record sat there that did not match my hands. The machine had woken briefly while I slept. 5 minutes. Then back to sleep. A new device had been connected, and then disconnected. The vendor string was one I did not recognize and did not like. It could have been a harmless read attempt. It could have been the first nibble of a line. I felt heat rise in my neck. Then I felt it pass. I did the pattern with my fingers on the table. 3. Pause. 2. Then, I began making changes. I rotated the passphrase on the wallet. I cycled the encryption. I moved a copy of the keys to an offline medium that Tommy had left me as a stopgap. I wrote down what I needed to write on paper with a pen and no camera in the room, and folded the paper into an envelope that I sealed with a strip of tape. I labeled it with a code that meant something only to me, and slid it under the lining of a drawer I had fixed years ago when the rails broke. Then I used a screwdriver to remove the outlet plate where the cable port had been, and placed the temporary drive in the gap behind the wall, and set the plate back, and tightened it with care. I shut down the laptop and disconnected the power. I pulled the battery out and set it aside to cool. Then I opened a small window and breathed. The smell of cut grass drifted up from the lawn. Somewhere a landscaper was doing his job. Somewhere the world was exactly the same as it had been yesterday. I texted Tommy. I told him Jacob had come by and stayed too long and that I had found a wake event I did not like. Tommy replied fast. He said keep the machine dark and lock the door, and he would be here at 8 with the full kit. He said we would set up a clean wallet, sign a transaction offline, and make no noise about it. He said the first rule when people sniff around is to move as if they are already in the room. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a number I did not know. I let it go to voicemail and read the transcription. A man said his name was Harris, and that he worked with families in transition on cataloging certain categories of assets. He said he had been asked to make contact and that he would be happy to stop by at my convenience. He left a callback. I did not call. I took a pen and added his name to my paper notes and drew a box around it. I spent the afternoon doing exactly nothing that could be mistaken for fear. I cleaned the counter. I fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door. I took out the trash and said hello to Mrs. Patel in 2B, who was carrying groceries up the stairs, and told me without asking that I looked tired. Back inside, I sat with the notebook and wrote what I knew in plain language. My father left a locked machine. Inside was a file. The file held keys. The keys matched addresses. The addresses held value. The value was not in the file. The value was on a public ledger. Control was the only thing that mattered. Close to 5, I looked out the window and saw a dark sedan idling at the curb with a driver who pretended to look at his phone. He could have been waiting for a friend. He could have been a rideshare between jobs. Or he could have been a man paid to watch a door. I let the blinds fall and went to the bedroom and pulled a small duffel from the closet. I packed the envelope with the handwritten notes, the temporary drive, and a change of clothes. Then I stopped and unpacked the clothes. I was not leaving. I was simply acknowledging that a new game had begun. The door buzzer rang once, and then again. Polite. I did not answer. My phone lit up with a text from Emily that said, Mom was having trouble sleeping, and it would comfort her to know we were sharing items the way Dad would have wanted. She said she was outside and could grab the laptop and return it later after Mr. Lane added it to the list. I stood in the hall where she could not see me and waited without moving. The buzzer rang a third time. Then silence. I sat back down at the table and positioned the laptop in the center and placed the battery beside it like a small animal resting. I wrote the time. I wrote the events of the day in short lines like a ledger. Visit by Jacob. Unknown device in logs. Call from Harris. Possible surveillance. Attempt by Emily to collect an item. Status unchanged. The sky turned the color of a bruise. My apartment took on that evening quiet that always feels like a test. I checked the lock on the door and then sat again. It was not pride I felt, and not panic either. It was something leaner. It was the part of me my father had tried to train when he made me stand beside him at that workbench and watch the screen without touching the keyboard. The part that knows when to wait. When it was fully dark, I moved the chair to face the door and rested my hands on my knees. I counted breaths until the numbers stopped mattering. Somewhere 2 floors down, a dog barked once, and then thought better of it. I thought of my father in the study tapping his ring on the desk, and I did the same rhythm on my thigh until the sound in my head settled. I did not turn on the television. I did not turn on music. I waited for 8. Chapter 6. 8 arrived like a held breath. Tommy knocked with the same rhythm as last night, and I let him in. He set a hard plastic case on the table and said we would keep it quiet and clean. He put on thin gloves and laid out a small laptop that had never touched the internet. A metal card with etched squares, a marker, and a sealed envelope. He nodded at the battery that I had set aside and said, "Good." We started with the room, phones in a drawer. Router unplugged, curtains closed. He looked at the ceiling once, the way a man checks for a leak, then went to work. He powered the clean laptop and generated a new wallet offline. He wrote the seed on the metal card slowly, letter by letter, then had me write it again on paper and seal it in the envelope. He said the first copy keeps you safe, and the second one keeps you honest. He slid both into the case and asked me to choose 2 places to store them that were not the same kind of place. One for fire and one for thieves. We connected the clone he had made and never let the old machine touch the table. He built a small test transaction with a tiny amount and signed it offline. He said we would broadcast it tomorrow from a different location, just to be sure the line worked. He moved through the steps without hurry and without show. I watched his hands and thought of my father fixing a broken latch on the garage door. Same attention to what mattered. No wasted motion. We checked the logs again on the old laptop. A wake event sat there from early morning. The same 5 minutes I had seen. A device signature with a generic vendor string. Tommy made a small sound in his throat that said he did not like it. He walked the apartment and found nothing. Then he told me to assume we had company until proven otherwise. He set a low-tech doorstop at the base of the door and smiled in a tired way that told me this was not his first visit like this. Before he left, he looked at the bourbon Jacob had brought and shook his head. He said I should buy a new deadbolt in the morning and pay cash. He put a hand on my shoulder that felt like a promise and told me not to touch the original file until we met again. He would keep the clone in a place that had no name. Then he was gone, and the apartment fell back into its quiet music of pipes and compressors. Days turned into weeks that felt longer than they were. I worked. I ate. I slept in short pieces. I met Tommy 3 times in places that did not sell coffee strong enough for the conversations we had. We set more backups. We checked the addresses again from a node he trusted. We never said the number out loud. I told no one else. I kept the original laptop dark and the battery in a drawer with a note on it that said, "Do not be stupid." On a Tuesday afternoon that looked like any other, a man in a blue suit knocked on my door and asked for Ethan Cole. He handed me a thick envelope and walked away without a word. The papers inside said I was being sued in civil court by my brother for wrongful retention and failure to disclose assets of the estate. The hearing was set for 2 weeks. The words did not surprise me. The speed did. I called Mr. Lane. He answered with the same even voice I had heard at the house. He said he had been expecting this and asked me to bring the envelope to his office. He told me to bring nothing else. Then he hung up in that careful way he had, as if the line itself could catch a feeling and take it somewhere it did not belong. His office sat in a brick building not far from the courthouse. He met me in a small conference room with a glass wall and a view of a parking lot that baked in the Texas sun. He read through the complaint and made pencil marks in the margins. He said Jacob had alleged that I was withholding a company device that likely contained business records and that my refusal to surrender it was obstructing the orderly settlement of the estate. He said the filing was not careless. It was designed to make a judge ask a simple question about cooperation. I asked him what we did. He tapped the pencil twice at the top corner and said we would cooperate with what was reasonable and refuse anything else. He said the law did not chase smoke and that a file on a machine was not an asset unless it could be identified and accessed and tied to the estate. He asked me if there was anything on the laptop that could be called a company record. I told him the truth. Receipts. Photos. A warranty for a lawnmower. He nodded and said, that was that. We showed up for the hearing 2 Fridays later. The courtroom was cool and clean and smelled faintly like old books and lemon cleaner. Jacob sat at the table with a lawyer I did not recognize, and Detective Harris behind them with a thin folder. Emily sat in the row behind Jacob and avoided my eyes. My mother was not there. I was grateful for that. The judge was a woman with silver hair and the kind of face that could listen and erase the noise around your words. She asked the other side to speak first. Jacob's lawyer stood and told a story about a grieving family and a difficult sibling who had taken a device that might contain critical information. He used the word transparency 3 times and the phrase orderly process twice. He did not say the word money. He did not have to. Mr. Lane stood and said my father's will had been executed exactly as written and that I had possession of the device that had been left to me. He said there was no evidence that the device contained any company property that had not been accounted for. He said we had offered to let a neutral third party scan for firm documents and that the other side had insisted on custody rather than inspection. He finished by saying the court should not be asked to turn a personal gift into a fishing expedition. Detective Harris took the stand. He spoke in a steady manner that sounded almost kind. He said he had been asked to opine on best practices for handling digital devices in estates. He said families often struggled with access. He said encryption made those struggles worse. He did not say he had been to my door. He did not say he had called. He did not say anything that moved the air in the room. When Jacob's lawyer asked if such devices could contain undisclosed assets, he said they could. When asked if he knew whether this device did, he said he did not. The judge leaned forward and asked one question. Was there any evidence before the court that the laptop contained property of the company or assets of the estate that had been omitted from the will? Jacob's lawyer started to answer with a maybe. And the judge lifted a hand and asked for evidence rather than possibility. He shuffled papers, then shook his head. The judge ruled without leaving the bench. The request for custody was denied. She said if the parties wished to arrange a neutral scan for company records, they could do so by agreement. She said this court would not compel the surrender of a personal effect, absent a specific showing that it contained what the movement claimed. She looked at Jacob and told him that grief did not grant new rights. Then she moved on to the next case like a train leaving a small station. Outside the courtroom, the light felt too bright after the cool of the wood and carpet. Jacob brushed past me without speaking. Emily looked like she wanted to say something, and then decided she did not. Detective Harris paused near the door and met my eyes for a moment. He had the look of a man who did not love his assignment and planned to do no more than the job required. He gave a small nod and kept walking. Mr. Lane and I stood under the building awning, where the shade took the edge off the heat. He told me good work without saying what he meant by that. He said my father had understood the limits of paper and the reach of the law, and that he had placed his trust in the one person who would not sell it for approval. I told him I did not intend to prove my brother right or wrong. I intended to be the kind of man my father thought he had raised. We walked to the curb, and he put a hand on my arm and told me to be mindful in the coming days. He said when a door closes in court, another one opens somewhere else, and that sometimes it is the door you forgot you had. He asked me if I needed a ride. I said I would walk. I headed down the block with my jacket folded over my forearm. The sun warmed my skin, and the noise of traffic rose and fell like surf. I passed a coffee shop where people laughed at something on a phone. I passed a hardware store and thought for a second about deadbolts. I kept moving. By the time I reached the parking lot behind Lane's building, my shoulders had loosened. The feeling was not victory. It was something closer to relief and caution holding hands. I pulled out my phone and saw a message from an unknown number. It said only that I should call. I deleted it and kept walking. Back at the apartment, I stood inside the door and listened. The room held the same silence it had held the night before. And the night before that. I set my keys on the counter and laid my palm on the table and tapped the pattern. 3. Pause. 2. Then I sat and waited for whatever would come next. Chapter 7. The apartment held the same quiet as the night before, but I could feel a thin pressure under it. Like a storm was somewhere out past the horizon and walking in my direction. I made coffee and watched the steam lift and disappear. My phone buzzed with a message from Emily. She said she wanted to talk. Just the two of us. No lawyers. No Jacob. She said she was sorry for the way things sounded at the house, and that grief turns everyone into a worse version of themselves. She said she was already in the neighborhood and could stop by for 10 minutes if that worked. I read the words twice and set the phone down. 10 minutes is long enough to change a life and short enough to pretend you did not mean to. I replied that I was home. She said she was on her way. I looked at the table. The old laptop sat closed with the battery still out. The clean machine Tommy had used for the offline work was in the closet. Powered down. I put the old battery in a drawer and set the drawer key on top of the fridge. I wrote one more line in my notebook. Expect a test. Emily knocked like a neighbor. I let her in. She had a box from a bakery and a bouquet in a mason jar. She looked tired in a way she would not advertise to anyone but family. She said she was sorry about the courtroom, and sorry about the noise at the house, and sorry about the things Jacob had said that she should have shut down. She put the flowers on the counter and opened the bakery box, and pulled out 2 small pies like we were kids again, and it was summer, and we had snuck dessert before dinner. I made coffee for her and poured water for me. We sat. She told a story about Dad falling asleep in the leather chair with a game on and a pencil in his hand. She told another one about a fishing trip where he got sunburned and would not admit it hurt. I laughed once without meaning to. It felt strange and good, and then it felt like a hook. She reached out and touched my wrist and said she missed him. I said I did too. Her eyes slid to the table. She asked if that was the laptop. I said it was. She asked if I had looked through it yet. I said a little. She said she would love to see any photos of Dad I had found. Just to show Mom. Nothing more. She said she would understand if I wanted to wait. She said all the right words in the right order, and then fell quiet, and let the silence do the rest. I stood and took our mugs to the sink, turned the water on and let it run. It was not a test I needed to pass. It was a test she needed to take. I let the water run long enough to sound like I was not listening for footsteps. I turned it off and came back. She was looking at her phone with her elbows on her knees like a person trying to make a call without making a decision. She smiled when she saw me and asked if she could use the bathroom. I pointed down the hall. When she was gone, I checked the old phone I had propped on a bookcase facing the table. The camera app ran with the screen off. A trick Tommy had shown me years ago when we were trying to catch a landlord entering our office after hours. It fed a preview to a small tile on my watch. It was not much, but it was enough. I set the watch face down so I would not stare at it. Emily came back and said I should repaint. I said I would. She asked how I was sleeping. I said better than I expected. She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot and said the light was good in here in the afternoon. She took out her phone and took a picture of the sky and said this would make Mom feel calmer than that empty study did. She turned back and smiled and said she was glad we had talked and that she felt better. And she asked if I could send her anything I found that reminded me of Dad so she could build a slideshow for the family. I said I would think about it. She hugged me lightly in the doorway and told me to be careful. Like an older sister who wanted to be believed. After she left, I locked the door and picked up the watch. The recording showed her sitting alone at the table when I was at the sink. She leaned in toward the old machine like she could will it to wake. She ran a finger along the edge of the lid and then pulled her hand back. Then she looked toward the hall, stood, and moved to the shelf by the couch where the clean machine had been the night before. It was not there. She scanned the room, found nothing, and came back. When she returned from the bathroom, she walked to the window and angled her phone toward the table. She took a photo of the screen even though it was off, then took another with the brightness slider up and the lens near the keyboard. She was fishing. That was the point. You put bait in the water and see if anything moves. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a number that had no name. I did not answer. A second later, a text came in from Jacob. He said, "Stop playing games." He said he knew what I had and that I was not smart enough to keep it. He said I should return the laptop before Mom had to watch the police take it back. A photo followed. It was a dark, blurry frame of my table, the black rectangle of the old laptop, a dim reflection of Emily in the glass. Nothing else. The numbers he wanted were not there. I saved the photo, then put the phone down. I sent Emily a message. I told her she had proven Dad right about trust, and that I hoped the debt she was working off was worth the piece of herself she had to spend. The dots came up and went away and came back and then stopped. She did not reply. Jacob called. I let it ring out and turned to nothing. I called Tommy and told him we were done waiting. He said to meet him in 20 minutes behind a machine shop on the edge of town where the shops close early and no one asks questions. I took the old battery from the drawer and put it in my pocket. I took the laptop and the hard plastic case with the clean wallet tools and locked the door. The sky turned copper while I drove. I took streets I did not need to take and checked the mirror until the habit got out ahead of the worry. The machine shop backed onto a gravel lot with a row of oil drums and a chain-link fence that had seen better days. Tommy stood with a coil of wire in one hand and a small steel pan in the other. He looked like a man about to fix a thing no one else could see. We worked without talking. He opened the case and took out the offline machine and the leads we had planned for this. He said we would do what we had sketched out on paper and not one step more. We set the clean wallet, confirmed the seed again, built a set of transactions that took funds from the old addresses to the new vault addresses, staggered by amounts and timing, so that they would not look like one move to anyone watching with hungry eyes. We signed them offline. He placed the signed files on a small card and slid it into a pocket I would not forget. He said we would broadcast from 3 different places over the next week. He said we would not speak those times out loud. I handed him the old battery. He took it and set it in the pan. He said we did not need to power the old machine again. We had what we needed. I asked him if he was sure. He said that when you are holding a door closed with both hands, the smartest thing you can do is build a new wall and step away from the door. We walked to the far corner of the lot where a metal barrel stood with ash in the bottom. He poured a little solvent into the pan and set the battery on top, and waited. He handed me a long lighter, and I sparked it. The fire took slow, then fast. He set the pan down under the barrel lip and fed the flame with spare cardboard until the heat climbed. When it was ready, he took the old laptop from me and asked if I wanted to say anything to it. I shook my head. He placed it on a sheet of metal over the mouth of the barrel so the heat could work without throwing embers. The paint curled first. The plastic next. The metal bent last. Like a spine that did not want to admit the years. We stayed until the shapes stopped being shapes. He used a long bar to tip the remains into the barrel. The ember glow looked like a city seen from the window of a plane. He said this was as clean as it would get without a foundry. I nodded and let the heat chase the last cold out of my hands. On the drive back, I did not turn on the radio. The streets felt empty. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the side window and did not look away. I did not feel like a man who had won. I felt like a man who had finally listened. At home, I locked the door and set the plastic case under the bed. I took the signed files card from my pocket and put it in the small envelope with my notes. Then slid the envelope behind the wall plate where the cable port used to be. I washed my hands until the water ran cool. I sat at the table and wrote the date. I wrote what we had done in the simplest words I could stand to see. Then I set the pen down. The room was very quiet. I could hear the compressor in the fridge and the soft tick of the cooling stovetop. I could hear the sound my father used to make when he tapped his ring on the desk. 3. Pause. 2. I did it once on the table with my fingertips. Then I folded my hands and let the quiet sit where it needed to sit. Chapter 8. Time did what it always does. It moved. The first broadcasts went out from a library in Round Rock, where the air conditioner fought the Texas sun and lost. The second from the back table of a diner off the interstate, where the waitress called everyone honey and never wrote anything down. The third from a quiet parking lot behind a storage facility, where the lights buzzed and drew a cloud of small bugs that looked like ash in the heat. Each push took a breath out of me and put it somewhere I could not get it back. Each time the confirmations rolled in, I felt the ground under my feet get a little more solid. I did not tell anyone. Tommy and I kept our schedule with the same discipline my father used on the yard when a truck was late. We did not rush. We did not spike the ball. I put my head down and worked. Small contracts for old clients. A little security work for a company that paid on time and did not ask questions. It did not need answered. I slept better and ate better, and took long, quiet walks at night, where no one knew my name. Seasons turned. A year became 2. News about the company floated through my phone like leaves in a gutter. Jacob expanded hard into warehouses near the coast, right before storms chewed through them. He borrowed against properties that looked good on paper and bled cash in the real world. He threw money at a regional logistics startup because someone at a golf course told him disruption was better than discipline. When rates jumped and fuel finally made its case, the bottom went out. Vendors posted ugly notices on the gates. Drivers walked. The bank tightened hands around the loans until the only move left was surrender. I watched from a distance and did not smile. Emily's marriage cracked in slow motion. Harsh listings. Price cuts. Then no listings at all. A friend of a friend said she had moved into a small rental after a fight about money that carried through the thin walls of a townhome in Westlake. I heard she tried to start a staging business and that it never caught. I heard she was seen crying in a parking lot holding a stack of papers that would not bend. I never asked what they were. My mother moved into a care home near the lake. The place was clean and bright, and did not smell like hospitals. A woman named Carla at the front desk kept a bowl of peppermint on the counter, and called everyone by name. I signed forms in a back office and kept the bills invisible. I visited twice a week. Sometimes 3. Most days my mother knew me. Some days she asked if I was late for school. I let her version of time win. I brought flowers and low jokes and old photos, and never stayed past the point where her eyes got glassy. On the drive back, I rolled the window down and let the air take the noise out of my head. I set up the foundation the way you set a bone. Cleanly. Carefully. Without talking about it. The Cole Legacy Foundation gave small scholarships at first. Community colleges. Trade programs. People who needed a semester to push a door open. I asked the advisors to keep my name off any public paperwork that did not require it. Even then, money leaves a trail. A local paper ran a short piece on an anonymous gift to a computer lab at a high school on the east side. A month later, a tech blog wrote about a fund that moved $5 million in digital assets into a donor account and asked questions about the origin. I did not answer because people who need help do not care about the story of the hand that reaches back for them. They care that it is steady. After 2 years, I left Austin. I told myself I was tired of heat, and tired of recognizing every street, and tired of the way memory clung to the siding of the old house like a stubborn vine. Seattle fit me. Clouds that did not brag. Water that did not complain. Streets where a man can walk and think and not see anyone he used to be. I rented a small place near a hill that made my legs ache in a good way. I kept the foundation quiet and the work steady. Tommy visited sometimes and we ate late and did not talk about numbers. 4 years after the night in my kitchen, I was sitting in a cafe that served coffee strong enough to wake a rock when a woman with dark hair and a tablet asked if she could take the chair at my table. She said her name was Grace Whitman, and that she wrote about technology and the people who use it to make small changes that look like big ones later. She said she had been following donation patterns tied to a fund with a name that sounded familiar. She said she had come to Seattle because the person behind the fund had a habit of moving between 2 cities and ordering the same pastry every time he sat down to talk about nothing. No one had used that voice with me since my father. Direct. Not unkind. Not impressed. I nodded at the chair. She sat. She told me what she thought she knew. She mentioned grants in Texas that seemed to come from nowhere, and then seemed to come again. She mentioned 2 community colleges where the admissions office saw a spike in adult students over 30 who had never taken a programming class and who all seemed to know about a small scholarship with a simple application. She mentioned a donation to a crisis shelter that had a clause for direct relocation when a victim needed to leave the state. She did not ask if it was me. She let the question sit in the center of the table like a coin you could flip if you wanted. I told her I like quiet work. I told her stories about men who taught me how to fix things that are not in manuals. I did not lie. I also did not help her write what she had already half written in her head. She asked what I thought about digital assets being used for something other than greed. I told her that value is a tool, and that tools tell you what kind of person holds them. She asked if I trusted the systems that move money now. I said I trusted people one at a time and never trusted systems with a smile. The conversation moved the way good ones do. No push. No agenda that needed to see itself in print. She was not there for gossip. She wanted a shape she could recognize so that the next piece she wrote would not drift into nonsense. She said she believed in putting detail in front of opinion. She said readers will do the math if you do not try to run the numbers before they see them. She reminded me of a teacher I had once who graded hard and fair. When she stood to go, she paused and thanked me for the time. She said she did not know if there was a story here, or if what she had was a shadow on a wall that only looked like someone she might recognize. She said if I ever wanted to talk off the record in a way that meant something to someone who needed it, I knew how to reach her. She wrote her number on a napkin and left it under the edge of the plate like a small flag you could pretend not to see if you needed to. After she left, my phone buzzed. Not a call. A tiny alert from a monitor I kept for only one thing. A transaction had landed in a wallet label that meant nothing to anyone but me. Another grant funded. A different city this time. A place I had never been. The screen went quiet again, and I sat there with my hands around the cup until the coffee went warm and then cool. On the way back to the apartment, I walked 3 extra blocks for no reason other than it felt good to move. The sky hung low, and the water that threatened rain made the streetlights glow like they were trying their best. I climbed the hill and counted the steps and told myself the number did not matter as long as I kept going. In the lobby, the manager had put out a bowl of hard candy that tasted like winter. I took one and kept it in my pocket like a small joke. Upstairs, I set my keys in the dish and stood by the window until the glass fogged with my breath. I thought about Jacob. I had seen a photo online of him leaving a meeting room with a file under his arm and a smile he could not sell. I thought about Emily. Someone had posted a picture from a fundraiser where her dress outshone the expressions on every face near her. And for a second I felt a stab of memory for the girl who once snuck dessert for us and made it taste like a secret. I thought about my mother asleep in a room that did not need her to remember what day it was to treat her like someone who mattered. I sat at the small table by the window and opened the notebook. I still kept the same way I used to keep it. Plain paper. Plain words. I wrote the date. I wrote that the cafe had felt safe. I wrote that a reporter had asked honest questions and left without trying to take anything that did not belong to her. I wrote that a grant had landed and that a young man I would never meet might buy a used laptop this week that would get him to a class, that would get him to a job, that would buy him time to think. I wrote that this was a good day. The room settled into the kind of quiet I had learned to respect. Not the smug silence of people who think they own it. The earned quiet of a place where work has been done and put away. I made dinner that did not try to impress anyone. I washed the pan and set it on a towel to dry. I looked at the little metal card in the lockbox and felt the weight of it in my hand without lifting it. Before bed, I stood at the window again and watched a ferry crawl across the dark water. I tapped my fingers on the sill in the pattern I always came back to. 3. Pause. 2. For a moment, I heard my father at the workbench in the garage. The small sounds that add up to a life you can be proud of. I told him what he already knew. That the test was not about money. That it never had been. The phone glowed once on the table. Another small confirmation. Another move along a line no one else sees. I let it fade. Then turned off the lamp and let the city make the only music I needed. Chapter 9. Morning light spilled across the table. Pale and soft. The kind that makes the world look cleaner than it really is. I stood there with my coffee, watching the steam fade, listening to the slow rhythm of the city waking up below me. The night before still lingered in my body. The fairy lights. The sound of water. The tap of my fingers against the window frame. I didn't dream. Or maybe I did, and just didn't need to remember. A news alert blinked on my phone. The kind that always tries to make everything sound like the end of the world. This one wasn't far off. The headline read, "Coal Logistics declares bankruptcy. Founder under investigation for fraud." I stared at it for a long time. Not angry. Not even surprised. Jacob had built his castle on loans and promises. The walls were always made of paper. Now the wind had come. I clicked the link. The article was short, clean, impersonal. The kind of writing that sounds like sympathy when it's really relief. It said he was cooperating with authorities. It said the company's assets would be liquidated. It said employees were left unpaid and vendors were suing. It said he had declined to comment. I imagined him sitting in his office. The blinds half closed. His tie still perfect, even when the ground gave way. My coffee went cold before I realized I hadn't taken a sip. I set it down and pulled the old notebook toward me. The page from last night waited with a half-finished sentence. I read it. Then finished it. Every story has its weight. You just decide what you carry forward. A soft knock broke the quiet. Not the kind of knock that meant trouble, just a human sound. Patient and polite. I opened the door and found a delivery driver holding a manila envelope with my name printed on it in sharp black ink. No return address. I signed and closed the door. Inside, there was a letter and a single sheet of paper with handwriting I recognized. My father's. I hadn't seen it in years. The note was short. If you're reading this, you did what you were supposed to. You didn't trade patience for noise. I never wanted to leave you money. Ethan, I wanted to leave you time. Use it. I ran my thumb over the ink, like it might still be wet. Behind the letter was a statement of donation. My foundation had received a secondary endowment from an anonymous source. The routing line showed an old, cold wallet tag. One of the first my father ever used when he taught me about trust and verification. He'd built the safety net before I even knew I'd fall. I sat for a long while before calling Tommy. He answered on the first ring. I told him about the letter. He let out a low sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He said maybe the old man had more moves left than either of us thought. I asked him what he'd do if he were me. He said he'd do what I was already doing. Keep quiet. Keep building. Keep choosing who gets to win. That afternoon I drove south along the coast. The clouds broke over the water, and sunlight hit the surface in a way that made the whole bay look like it was on fire. I stopped at a diner halfway between nowhere and somewhere. The kind of place where everyone's coffee is bottomless and nobody cares who you are. I ate eggs, bacon, and toast with too much butter. It tasted exactly like it needed to. When I paid the check, the waitress smiled and said, I looked like a man who had finally figured something out. I told her maybe I had. I drove until the sky turned orange, then purple. I thought about the version of myself who walked out of that house with a dusty laptop and nothing else. I thought about the man who sat in a courtroom being accused of theft, when the real crime had already been committed by everyone who thought they were entitled to everything. I thought about how revenge stops feeling good once you realize peace is quieter and lasts longer. By the time I reached the overlook above the Sound, the city was a collection of small lights below me. I rolled down the window and let the cold air fill the car. The smell of salt and pine mixed together. Somewhere out there, people were chasing what they thought would fix them. I wasn't one of them anymore. I pulled the small metal card from my pocket, ran my thumb over the grooves of the seed words. until I could feel the weight of every choice that had led here. I didn't think of it as fortune. I thought of it as responsibility. Inherited and earned. The phone buzzed once. A message from the foundation coordinator. Another grant approved. Another student funded. The world turning quietly. Exactly how it should. I leaned back and looked at the sky. The clouds had started to break apart. Stars showing in pieces like the first light through an old curtain. I thought about my father's note again. Time. Not money. That was the lesson. Time to think. Time to build. Time to be the man he hoped I'd become. The wind came through the window. Cold and clean. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel. 3. Pause. 2. Sometimes you don't get justice. You just get the truth. And if you're lucky, that's enough. And if you've been following my story this far, tell me what you would have done. Would you have kept the secret or burned the whole thing down? Because in the end, that's what stories like this are for. Not for the revenge, for the reflection,